Tammy?
We um, worked in the same church calling together. And so I got to know her through that church calling,
And when you say church calling, what church is that associated with?
the LDS church.
And what callings did the two of you hold where you worked closely?
I was the Relief Society president, and she was my first counselor.
How often do you think you saw Tammy?
We met um, once a week and on Sundays.
And did that seeing each other twice a week continue for an extended period of time?
Until her death.
And do you recall when the two of you were given the callings?
Um, October of 2018.
So for about a year, you
Mhm.
would see Tammy about twice a week.
Yes.
Did you get to know Tammy pretty well?
I thought so. I thought we did.
And can you describe Tammy a little bit, your relationship with her? Let me back up. Can you describe a little bit about what Tammy was like?
Yes. She was great to work with. She was organized when we had our meetings. She could worked on the computer. So when we had to change anything, she could do it in a flash. She did all the computer work. When we organized activities, we valued her opinion and was grateful to have her input on things. And she would say, keep it simple, keep our activities simple. And we did, and that helped a lot. She had a lot of empathy for some of the women who were struggling in the ward, and she would relate those things to us in our meetings. She also had a very good wit with her.
Did you have occasions to observe Chad and Tammy together?
I did mostly at church, and um, and they seemed great at church. You know, it was just normal. It was, and we had activities. He did come and help set up some chairs for activities, and so that seemed normal, and I really didn't think much of it.
At some point in time, did you feel like their interactions changed?
A little bit, yes. In 2019, it just seemed distant. It just seemed a bit distant between the two. But I just noticed them at church.
Did Tammy ever talk to you about her marriage?
She didn't. I think the only thing she did mention was that sometimes the finances were a little strained, but she didn't mention anything else.
When you observed Tammy, did you ever notice her appear to slow down?
No,
Did you ever notice any change in her activity level prior to her death?
no,
Did she ever complain to you about any health issues?
no,
Did you ever observe Tammy have any shaking fits?
no,
Did you ever observe Tammy faint?
no.
How did you learn about Tammy's death?
On the morning of the 19th, I received a phone call from Emma, and she was
Objection, Judge. This is going to call for some hearsay.
It's eliciting hearsay on that part, so that's sustained.
And just to clarify, when you say on the 19th, is that October 19th of 2019?
Yes.
And you indicated that Emma had phoned you. How did Emma seem when you talked to her?
She was sobbing.
And after that, based on that phone call, without saying what Emma said, did you learn anything in relation to Tammy?
That she had passed away.
Objection, Judge. Calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
At some point, did someone else take the phone?
Chad, he took the phone.
And what did Chad tell you?
He asked me not to tell anybody for about an hour that she had passed away. And I said, well, I need to tell the bishop. And he said, no, don't tell the bishop. And I knew that the bishop was he was going to work. And so I called him anyway and informed him.
And what you called to inform him was of Tammy's death?
Yes,
Were you surprised to hear of her passing?
yes.
And why were you surprised?
I had just talked to her on Wednesday and she was fine. She was excited. She had just gotten a new grandbaby. We had talked about Mark and his mission, and she had told us experiences of his mission, and she was excited with things.
On October 19th, after learning of her death, at some point, did you end up going to the Daybell residence?
Yes, my husband and I went over at about 8:30 in the morning, and Chad answered the door, and he gave us a hug, and we went in, and all the children, except for Mark and their spouses, were sitting there in the living room. They were stunned. The children were stunned. They could hardly speak and crying.
Did you end up making any observations of Chad when you arrived?
Yes, when I asked him what happened, and he said that Tammy vomited at midnight, and they think she passed away at 2 a.m., and that her legs were hanging over the bed and that she'd fallen out of bed. He also said they think, how did I say this? That they think she died of an embolism.
And Chad provided all this information the morning of her death.
Yes.
How did Chad appear to you?
He wasn't as upset as the children. He had was ready to tell us, and he wasn't as devastated as the children were.
And you indicated you'd just seen her the Wednesday before her death.
Yeah.
Did she complain to you at all that day of any health issues?
No. And I knew she was taking clogging lessons when we would have activity nights.
Judge, I'm going to object at this point, just going into a narrative.
Overruled.
You can answer.
I can answer. We had activity nights, which started at like, I think 6:30. She would leave early, maybe 8 o'clock, because she was going to a clogging class. And so in my mind, I'm thinking I'm going home to bed at 8 o'clock. She was going to a clogging class. So I admired her for doing that.
On Wednesday, when you saw her, did Tammy have a cough that you noticed?
No,
Did she have any kind of a coughing fit around that time?
I didn't notice any.
After arriving at the Daybell residence, did you do something else that morning?
Yes, we had asked if they had breakfast and they hadn't. So my husband and I said, well, we'll go get you breakfast. And as we stood up to go, Chad told us that her funeral was going to be on Tuesday and a memorial on Wednesday. And I was surprised and I said, well, did you plan this? And he said, no, but I was surprised that fast that he could tell me that.
And when you ask if he planned it, why did you ask that?
Because I know what it takes to plan a funeral with a ward and to organize the church and have the ladies in the ward provide the meal And you need to ask the sisters to volunteer to provide meals. And it takes time. All of it takes time. So I was really surprised. But then he said her funeral was in Springville. That also surprised me because we were there in Idaho.
And do you recall what day of the week October 19th was?
Saturday,
And the funeral was going to be on the following-
Tuesday.
And did Chad respond when you asked if he had already planned the funeral or if he and Tammy had talked about it before?
He said no, but I felt like it had been planned.
Did you end up attending the funeral?
Yes. I needed to see her. So my husband and I went to the funeral in Springfield. And I needed to see her in the casket. And she looked nice in the casket.
Did you ever talk to Chad about why he held the funeral in Springville?
I didn't. I just assumed it was because they lived there before. So I didn't ask.
When you were at the funeral, do you recall making any observations of Chad?
When we viewed her before the funeral, and it was just him standing by the casket. It didn't seem really mournful with him. He said, I said, oh, she looks good. And he said, yes, she does. And we didn't cry. We didn't, it didn't seem mournful. And then we went into the chapel to sit for the funeral. And I sat by, and our bishop had driven down, so we sat with him.
During the funeral, do you recall if Chad spoke?
Yes, all the children spoke, and he spoke last. I was impressed with the children's talks that fast. They did a nice job to their mother. I was surprised because it takes a day to drive. So to go funeral on Tuesday, they would have driven Monday. They did the children did a nice job. And Chad spoke last. I was surprised because most spouses are too devastated to speak. And so I was surprised that he spoke at her funeral, and it was last. And it was like a church talk. The other talks were more loving tributes to their mother. His was more church talk.
And do you recall if there was a memorial service held?
It was held the next day in Idaho, but I did not attend because I had just been to her funeral.
Did you end up having a role or playing a part in taking a meal to Chad's family?
Yes, so our presidency and the bishopric provided a meal for them after the memorial, and so we took it over to them after, and we had put it down for them to eat, and the kids had started to eat. And Chad told us that he was moving out, that he couldn't be there, and that he was going to move to Rexburg to a condo. And we asked him, like, do you need help or anything? He said no, that his friend had a condo for him, that he wasn't there very often, so that he told him he could stay there.
And you said do you recall, did Chad refer to the friend as a he?
In I took it as that, and I'm thinking he said because he said he wasn't there very often, and so he could stay there.
So Tammy's pronounced dead on Saturday, correct? And by the following Wednesday, Chad's got plans to move out of the house.
Yes.
Do you recall anything else that morning standing out to you as far as what Chad told his kids?
He had told his kids to go through Tammy's things after he told us he was moving out, and that surprised me too. That's maybe I'm more sentimental, but it just seemed fast. And they kind of took it in stride, and I think they did do that.
In the time just after Tammy's death, did you have an opportunity to observe any of the Daybell children? So Chad and Tammy's children.
I went and saw Emma on Friday, and she was sobbing. She's really struggling, and she was getting really sick. She lost a lot of weight. We had organized meals for her. I know the school district was taking meals into her and Garth. She was struggling. She told me she missed
Judge,
her mother.
objection,
Grounds,
hearsay.
sustain.
Did Emma appear to be struggling to you?
Yes.
Did Garth appear to be struggling as well?
Yeah. Yes.
And on Friday, to the best of your knowledge, had Chad moved out of the residence?
Yes. I think he moved after the memorial.
So you visited with Garth and Emma just less than a week after their
On
mother's
Friday. Yeah.
Was Chad there when you went to visit him?
No.
And when you say the house you went to, what house was Emma staying in at that time? Do you recall?
Yeah, she lived Keeney cornered from Chad's house.
And do you know what house Garth was staying in?
And Garth was living in Chad's house.
At some point, did you end up reaching out to Chad?
Yeah, so we thought we would call and see how he was doing. And I think it was Saturday, the 26th of October. We called him to see if we could come and visit with him. And he said no, that he would come to our place. So he came on the 26th. He came over to our place. I think it was more toward the evening when he came.
And Judge, for foundation purposes, that would have been the month of what and year?
Like, do you want to clarify when that happened, please?
And when you talk about the 26th, are we still in October of 2019?
Yes.
So just shortly after Tammy's passing.
Yes.
And Chad indicated to you he didn't want you to come to his place, but he'd come to yours.
Yeah. He said, "Oh, I'll come over to your place." So we said, okay.
Did you ever end up seeing where Chad was living in Rexburg?
No.
And did he in fact end up coming to your place?
He did.
And did you end up having a conversation with him at that time?
Yes. He sat at our kitchen table, and I had made cookies and thought that, we would make it nice. And he said that he found the woman he was going to marry. And we were absolutely stunned when he said that. And we asked him, well, where did you meet her? And he said, at the conference in St. George in 2018. And we asked who she was, and he wasn't going to tell us at first. And then he said, well, I'll tell you. Her name is Lori Vallow.
Had you heard the name Lori Vallow before then?
I hadn't, I was thinking, who is Lori Vallow? And then he mentioned that she had done a podcast with Melanie Gibb. And then I realized that's who that was.
Had you ever met Melanie Gibb in person?
Not then. I hadn't met her in person.
And you'd never met Lori Vallow at that point?
No.
And to the best of your recollection, this was around October 26th.
Yes.
So just 7 days after Tammy's passed away.
Yeah.
Were you surprised to hear that Chad had already found someone else to marry?
Absolutely.
At some point, did you end up meeting Lori Vallow?
Yes. While he was at our home, he said that she was in town. Would we like to meet her? We said yes. Tuesday nights, my husband and I had gone to the temple. So we were in the temple on Tuesday nights. We were waiting in a room for a meeting to begin that following Tuesday. And he tapped us on the shoulder and had us step out in the hallway. And then that's where we met Lori and her niece, Melanie, and a friend. I cannot remember her name.
And that was your first time meeting Lori,
Yes,
and it was at the temple.
it was at the temple.
And Judge, could we have some foundation as to the date, time?
Your Honor, that's already been discussed.
I must have missed it, Judge.
Go ahead, Ms. Blake.
Ms. Gilbert, at some point after that, did Chad and Lori end up coming to your house?
Yes. And it was in that week, and I think it was Friday from that Tuesday that he came over with her. And it was cold when they came in. I asked her if she was getting used to the cold, and she said she'd bought some warm clothes. And they sat on the couch. And it was awkward.
And when you say it was awkward, did you make observations of Chad and Lori's interactions?
Yes, they were very affectionate with each other, more than I had ever seen Chad. It was very affectionate with her, and they were giggling and laughing, and my husband and I were embarrassed.
Had you ever seen Chad act that way with Tammy?
No.
Did you end up talking at that time to Lori about her family?
I did. I asked her if she'd been married, and she said yes, that her husband had died in December of a heart attack. I asked her if she had children. And then Chad said that she had recently had a daughter that had passed. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. And I said, how many? And she said, thank you. And I said, how many children do you have? And she kind of stammered and said they were stepchildren, and I did not get a definite answer on that.
When Chad said that she'd recently lost a daughter, did Lori say anything to correct that or change it?
No.
And this would have occurred end of October, beginning of November of 2019. Is that correct?
Yes.
You also talked about, you asked Lori if she was getting used to the cold. Do you recall anything about that particular October?
Yes, it was a very cold October. It was an early frost and a hard frost. So the farmers were getting their potatoes early. I used to work for an ag company, and so the importance of the potatoes not freezing. And not only that, they were helping each other to get their crops out early. So it was a cold October.
When Chad and Lori were there, did they talk to you and your husband about plans for a future together?
Yes, they had talked about getting married, but they didn't know when or where yet. They planned on taking the kids to Disneyland at Thanksgiving time.
And did Chad tell you anything about his plans to write a book?
Yes, he told us he was going to Hawaii to write a book. But I didn't know they were going to live there. He just said he was planning on writing a book and going to Hawaii.
So Chad mentioned he was going to be going to Hawaii,
Mhm.
correct?
Yes.
And he and Lori also mentioned their plans to get married to you.
Judge, there's been some leading here.
Sustain.
And this took place in end of October, beginning of November 2019.
Yes.
When they talked about taking the kids to Disneyland, do you know which kids they were referencing?
It was Chad's children.
Did they ever mention taking any of Lori's children with them?
No, I had the impression that she was an empty nester, and I assumed the daughter was older that had passed, from a disease or cancer or something that I assumed she didn't have any other children.
Did Chad or Lori provide you any details as to how Lori's daughter died?
No, and I did not ask.
And Your Honor, I'm just looking at the time, and now may be a good time to take a break in testimony for the lunch hour.
Okay, I appreciate that, Ms. Blake. We will go ahead and take the noon lunch hour. We'll take the hour and be back on for additional testimony at 1 o'clock.
All right, please.